My name is William Fredrick Brown. I was born in Sandy, Utah, in the year of July the 10th, 1880. I have been asked to give some of the things of my younger experience. My parents and family's name were as follows. Father, Alfred Henry Brown. He was born in Coventry, England. He left England when he was about 12 years old with his uncle and aunt, Mr. and Mrs. William Morrow. They came to Salt Lake City. My mother's name was Frances Jane Torman. She was born in Winsburg, Pennsylvania. She came with her parents to Salt Lake. She met my father there. They were married both, and they both belonged to the LDS Church. I had 4 sisters named Mamie, Jane, and Linda, and Minnie, and Winifred. 2 brothers, Alfred H. and Francis Charles. My folks moved to Pocatello in the spring of 1882. My father was employed by the Oregon Short Line as a trainman. As there was no place to live at that time, only some small outfit to railroad cars being used for the help, and about 12 company houses for the officials to live in on the first row of the company ground allotted to the railroad. My father had to be careful where to build on the reservation on account of the Indians might burn him down. So he started to build what you would call a tent house just back of one of the company houses. The master mechanic's name, Hickey, lived in one of those places. So he had to be quite a time building the tent house. He first made a wooden floor, then built a side wall there and put a large tent over the same, and built the best he could inside of the tent. We had to carry our water from one of the company houses a short distance. The water was piped from the city creek and a small pump station up the Portneuf River to supply the railroad. The railroad built a large wooden water tank just east of where they put up a large 2-story hotel. The first floor had a saloon and dining rooms. Sleeping quarters were upstairs. Next to the hotel was a small baking shop and a cook room. Then came the depot, waiting room, a lunch counter, and ticket office. Then a small green park, then a large office upstairs. Baggage and express telegraph offices were downstairs. The shops had a large rip track where most of the boxcars and cabooses were repaired. Also, all of the cars changed from the narrow gauge to the broad gauge. About in 1881, there was about 800 or 900 men working for the railroad at that time. Now I would like to mention some of our town locations. The first big general mercantile store was owned by Brown and Bible across the tracks. It was located just across the street from where Block's store now stands, where those new buildings now stand on First Avenue and Center Street. They shipped their merchandise west as far as American Falls to Albany, Idaho by freight wagons. Next on Front Street, are called the front row of First Avenue next to the railroad. There was about 12 saloons and gambling places, also some honky-tonks and skid row. It would be hard to believe just how wild and woolly human beings can become, fighting and shooting each other. There wasn't much of law in these early days in Pocatello. We had one U.S. Marshal and his deputy, N.P. Nielsen, but McDaniels was just one of those old westerns that his work was law and his guns he carried backed him up. On the west side of the tracks was not too quiet either. As I said before, there was only one short street on Company Row and our town hall. 2 stories and the lower floor was occupied by the school. Upstairs for amusement and lodges. That was the first school I attended to. My first teacher was named Brashear, and he sure was one of those teachers that was the boss. I remember on one occasion there was 2 or 3 hard boys going to school that wanted to take over. On one occasion, one came to school after having a little trouble with his teacher, and he laid a gun and knife on his desk, but he did not scare anybody, and when the teacher called his bluff, he showed that yellow streak and was a tame boy from that time on. They also had later on held their elections there, and besides voting. There were some hard fighters going on when John Barleycorn became mixed in. Our first doctor was named Dr. Davis. He lived in one of the company houses. The first drugstore was Cook's, and the next was Dr. Bean's drugstore. One was on one side of the hall and the other on the other side. I'll mention some of the doctor's troubles like this one. For instance, Dr. Bean's, there was 2 old-timers who had been drinking, had a fight, and one had a cut on his head and went into Dr. Bean's to get it dressed. He was sitting in a chair waiting for the doctor, and about that time the other fellow came in the door, and the fellow started to reach in his pocket for a handkerchief. And the fellow coming in the door thought that he was reaching for a gun, and he shot and killed him where he sat. When the marshal arrested him and held him in a temporary jail until a temporary trial held by Judge Fisher, who was the only judge here, had a small office room just back of now where the Idaho Power is located now. And after he was sentenced, they were taking him to the train to go to Boise. He broke away and ran down a little alleyway or path. They started to shoot at him, and they was gaining on him, and he was coming toward our house. And at that time, another small boy and myself was coming toward him, pulling a little wagon. Some of the shot hit it, but did not hit, but missed us. Then he ran by and ran into a little English woman's house and hid under the bed. And she ran out and yelled, "He's in my house. Get him out quick." So they again caught him. Somebody had a shotgun with a small shot. he was sure in a mess from where he had been hit. While I'm telling you about what happened to some of the doctors, this is a good one. We had a doctor by the name of Dr. Rooker, also one of the early doctors here. He was also quite a character. He always carried a six-shooter he called Betsy, and used it if necessary. We had only a small gravel path if we wanted to go across the tracks to the east side. One day as Dr. Rooker was coming to the west side, a fellow stopped him to mooch a meal and pretended he was very hungry. The doctor, being kind, gave him the price of a meal. But the doctor just wondered if he really was hungry. So he watched him, and he went into a saloon. So the doctor went back and caught him and said, "I thought you was hungry. Now I will see that you get plenty to eat." So he took him in the restaurant and called the waiter and told him to bring a large bowl of boiled potatoes. The fellow did not want to eat them at first, but the doctor pulled out his gun and laid it on the table. You would have laughed to have seen how quick he ate them and cleaned them all up. Then the doctor advised him, "The next time you are hungry and want to eat, you'd better eat first and drink after." When the town site was surveyed, our places was in the middle of Lander Street, like many other places that were. So my father had decided to move down to the river where there was plenty of water and good soil on Lander and Grant. He settled on 10 lots down there. About where the high school auditorium now stands, the Keeney Cattle Company had a very large corral. It took in about 2 blocks. There was a blacksmith shop and a barn to keep the horses in and all their equipment. They also shipped large herds of cattle to eastern markets. I was quite a small boy. I had a fine dog, and I went over to the corrals to see the cowboys. I had a very nice dog, and was always with me. My mother was always afraid I would get hurt, so she told the cowboys to give me a good scare. So the next time I went over there, they, of course, came toward me and, of course, started to shoot. I thought at me, so I started to make the dust fly for home. That really broke me from going over there very often. I remember so well when we had moved down by the river, and the closest place to us was about a half a mile from us. One night, some Indians had been drinking. Just back of our house was a ford in the river that the Indians used to, in coming and going over to use as a shortcut to Banny Creek. My father could understand quite a bit of what they were talking about. And they were planning to come over and clean us out. My father told my mother to be ready with us children to go for help if he started to shoot. There was one Indian talked them out of coming, and soon they left after scaring us so badly. Another time the Indians used to ride on the railroad cars. At one time some were riding on the railroad coal cars that jumped the track, and 3 or 4 were killed in the Portneuf Canyon. They brought them in just below our home to hold their Indian powwows before burying them. They moaned and chanted 2 days or nights. There was one funny thing I never forgot. One of the boys' father that was killed was a big fellow, and he would moan and chant then. And all at once he would stop, and there was quite a number of whites coming and going, and then he would say, "My poor biggie boy, he gone. Give me 25 cents for him." I remember when I was just a small boy about the cowboys and the switchmen. One of the cowboys came in the town to have a little spree by himself. And at the time, the only saloon that amounted to anything was in the railroad hotel. So he became pretty well liquored up. And some of the switchmen got in a fight with him and beat him up and took his watch and other things. So when he began to sober up, he got his horse and left town. And that afternoon, there was quite a crowd of cowboys rode into town and went over to the hotel looking for the switchman. And by that time, the word had got around to the different ones about it. And they all hid out, and no one admitted there were any switchmen around. So finally they found his watch and other things and had a few drinks, and all left in good spirits. My father dug the first well and built the first big water wheel and planted the first large garden in Pocatello. He raised almost everything that could be raised here. He never tried to sell anything, but gave it away freely. We had a fine well water, and people carried it for 4 or 5 blocks. He put up a little shed over the well and had the oaken buckets drawn up and down with the wheel. Also a tin cup in there for people to drink, never charging anything from the people who used it to come for blocks to get the cold water. We always had plenty of fish almost at our door, native trout. Plenty of game close. The first dam was made in the river at the end of my father's fence to run in a wooden flume 2 blocks, then into a large ditch to create power to get the generation here for electricity plant. Just below this dam, it was quite amusing to watch the people come down with their long lines and poles. In the spring of the year, the fish would come up so plentiful that they used a lot of hooks along these lines to snag. And the fish that they would catch there would fill tubs. And how they would carry them away, and what a great feast they would have on many of these fish. When I was about 13 years old, I worked for Al Lewitt in his bottling works. He had the first plant in Pocatello. The next place I worked was at Ross's Fork Agency, now called Fort Hall. There was nothing there but the agency and the Indians. I learned just to speak a little Indian. That was when they paid their annuity money for the land they had sold there. And they spent their money like drunken sailors. Then I worked in some other Pocatello stores clerking and taking morning orders for their groceries. I also worked in the evenings on the stage of the old Pocatello House. That was how I learned most of my step dancing. I also had a dancing school. I had a large class, and I called the dancing school the Delta Dancing School. I went to work for the Pocatello Water Company in 1902. My job was riding the pipeline and taking care of the valve house and seeing that the reservoirs kept filled. The owner of the company was A.F. Murray, a millionaire who lived in Butte, Montana. At one time when they figured they would have to have more water, the superintendent, George Winters, also was a fine civil engineer. After looking Gibson Jack and Ming Creek over, they were decided to make 2 dams, which they figured could supply about 40 or 50,000 people, and it would have been fine mountain water. But shortly after that, the city offered them $250,000 for the water company. So Murray thought that was the best plan, so he sold it. They had made these, if they had made these dams, they would have had fine, soft mountain water and all gravity. The city would have saved thousands of dollars and better water. Superintendent Winters was one to have caused that the U.S. Reserve be located and the U.S. supervisor to live up Ming Creek to patrol the water to keep cattle and sheep from polluting it. Pete Renstead was the first one appointed as ranger. I also rode some of the reserve myself. Just before I left the water company, I had met the girl of my choice, Ida Belva Wakely. Also, she had been teaching for 3 years before we were married in July the 10th, 1905. She was the daughter of John and Lena Wakely. They lived in Marsh Valley. Soon after being married, I went to work for the Oregon Short Line Railway in train service. We have had 6 children. Our oldest child, Melva, passed away when she was 10 years old. Their names were as follows: Melva, Fredrick William, Dean Wakely, and Wanda, and Virgil Earl, and Paul, Dr. Paul Vernon. Fred now lives home. Dean lives at Price, Utah, teaching, and Wanda at Las Vegas. Virgil lives at Fresno, California, in business. Dr. Paul and thee at Stockton. I worked for the railroad until I was pensioned in August the 3rd, 1950. My wife and I have had plenty to keep us out of mischief to do. We have had 9 apartments to take care of. Also, we belong to the LDS Church and have always enjoyed our church work very much. Hoping you have enjoyed some of our early experiences in Pocatello, I remain yours respectfully, Fred W. Brown, 652 West Lander.